1943, over Nazi Germany. American bombers dropped explosives from nearly 4 miles up and hit targets within 75 feet. A precision the Germans thought impossible and called technological witchcraft. The top-secret Norden bombsight could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, giving the Allies a weapon that terrified German high command. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Was the Norden bombsight's legendary accuracy real, or was it the greatest bluff of World War II? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1940, the German officers stood on the rooftops of Berlin and watched the sky with calm eyes. They had built the strongest air defense system in the world. Their anti-aircraft guns could shoot down planes from miles away. Their fighter pilots were trained better than anyone else. Their spies knew everything about British and American planes. When bombs did fall on German cities, they fell randomly, scattered across miles of land like seeds thrown by a careless farmer. The Germans knew a simple truth that made them sleep well at night. No plane flying high enough to avoid their guns could drop a bomb with any real aim. The math was simple and cold. A bomber at 20,000 feet was almost 4 miles up in the sky. At that height, wind pushed the plane sideways. Air currents made bombs drift and tumble. The pilot could barely see the ground below through clouds and smoke. Dropping a bomb accurately from that height was like trying to throw a rock into a bucket while standing on top of a mountain during a windstorm. It simply could not be done. The best bombers in the world, flying in perfect conditions, might land a bomb within half a mile of their target. Usually they missed by much more. German cities had been hit, yes, but the damage was spread thin. A bomb would destroy one factory while missing 10 others nearby. This made the Germans confident. They could rebuild faster than the enemy could aim. Across the ocean in America, a small group of engineers worked in secret rooms that had guards at every door. They had been working for years on a machine that seemed impossible. It was called the Norden bombsight, and it looked like a metal box filled with gears, mirrors, and tiny spinning wheels. The device weighed about 50 pounds. Inside were over 2,000 parts that had to work together perfectly. The Norden used math that most people could not understand. It measured the plane's speed, the wind's push, and the exact moment to release the bomb so it would fall in a perfect arc toward the target below. The machine did calculations that would take a human an hour to figure out, and it did them in seconds while the plane bounced and shook in the sky. The men who built it called it the most advanced tool of war ever created. The military kept it more secret than almost anything else in the war. Bomber crews had to swear an oath never to talk about it. If a plane was going to crash, the bombardier was supposed to destroy the Norden with a hammer before jumping out. The military feared that if the Germans captured one and figured out how it worked, they could build their own or find ways to stop it. But in those early years of the war, American bombers flew over Europe and their bombs still missed. They missed by hundreds of feet, sometimes thousands. Factories stood untouched while bombs made craters in empty fields. The problem was not the Norden bombsight. The problem was everything else. Clouds covered the targets. Smoke from earlier bombs hid the ground. German fighters attacked the bombers and made them swerve and dive. Anti-aircraft shells exploded around them and knocked them off course. The men operating the Norden were young and scared. Their hands shook. They rushed their calculations because they wanted to drop the bombs and turn for home before they got shot down. The Norden could tell them exactly when to release the bombs, but only if the plane flew straight and steady and the bombardier had time to line everything up just right. In real battle, that almost never happened. So the bombs kept missing, and the Germans kept watching from their rooftops, and they kept believing that accurate bombing from high altitude was impossible. Their scientists had done the math. Their intelligence officers had studied captured Allied equipment. Everything they knew told them the same thing. The laws of physics protected them. No machine could overcome wind and distance and human error all at once. Then something started to change. It was small at first, easy to miss. In late 1943, a German officer stood in the ruins of a ball-bearing factory near Schweinfurt. The factory was critical for making parts that went into tanks and planes. It had been hit by American bombs, and the officer walked slowly through the wreckage, taking notes. What he saw made him stop and look again. The bombs had not scattered randomly. They had hit in a tight pattern, clustered around the factory's main buildings. The damage was not spread across the city. It was focused like a knife point directly on the target. The officer measured the craters. Most were within 200 feet of the center of the factory. A few were even closer. He wrote in his report that this seemed unusual, perhaps lucky. But the next week, another factory was hit the same way. Then another. German reconnaissance planes flew over the bombed sites and took photographs from above. The photos showed something that should not be possible. Bomb craters forming tight circles around bridges, oil refineries, and railroad yards. The circles were getting smaller. By early 1944, some bombing raids were landing most of their explosives within 100 feet of the target. The German High Command received these reports with growing worry. Their experts checked the numbers again and again. Something had changed in the American bombers. Either the Americans had discovered new science that Germany did not know, or they had built a machine that should not exist. The officers in Berlin stopped standing calmly on rooftops. They started asking questions that no one could answer. How were the Americans doing this? What technology did they have? And most important, could Germany survive bombs that fell exactly where the enemy wanted them to fall? The testing grounds in New Mexico had proven what the Norden could do in perfect conditions. On clear days with no wind and no one shooting at the plane, bombardiers could drop practice bombs into circles painted on the desert floor. The circles were only 75 feet across, and the bombs landed inside them again and again. From 20,000 feet up, from almost 4 miles in the sky, the Norden guided bombs to targets smaller than a tennis court. The military officers who watched these tests felt their hearts beat faster. If this worked in real war, everything would change. But New Mexico was not Germany. The desert had no clouds, no smoke, no fighters trying to kill you. So when the bombers flew their first missions with properly trained crews and time to aim, everyone held their breath and waited to see what would happen. The results came back in photographs taken after the raids. Intelligence officers spread the pictures across tables and measured the craters with rulers. Their hands moved quickly, checking the numbers twice, then 3 times. At a synthetic oil plant in Merseburg, 17 bombs out of 20 had landed within 100 feet of the main refinery tower. The tower was destroyed. The pipes around it were twisted metal. Production at the plant stopped completely. At a railroad bridge over the Rhine, bombs cut the bridge in half and left both ends standing. The explosives had hit the exact center span where the supports were weakest. At an aircraft factory near Munich, the bombs avoided the workers' housing nearby and struck only the assembly buildings. The pattern was so tight that it looked like someone had drawn a circle on the ground and told the bombs to land inside it. German generals gathered in meeting rooms deep underground where Allied bombs could not reach them. They spread their own photographs on tables and argued about what they meant. Some said the Americans had simply gotten lucky. War was chaos, and chaos sometimes created patterns that looked like skill. But the lucky strikes kept happening, week after week, month after month. Other generals said the Americans must have spies on the ground in Germany, people who were setting up radio beacons or lights to guide the bombs. Teams were sent to search the bombed areas for hidden equipment. They found nothing. The truth was harder to accept. The Americans had built a machine that worked better than German science said was possible. One Luftwaffe officer stood up during a meeting and said what others were thinking but afraid to speak. The Americans could now hit anything they wanted from any height they chose. If they wanted to destroy a specific building in a city, they could do it. If they wanted to cut a road or collapse a tunnel or wreck a train station, they could do that too. The Germans had designed their whole war strategy around the idea that strategic bombing did not work well enough to matter. Now that idea was dying, and they had no backup plan. The Norden bombsight worked because it was not just one machine, but a complete system. The bombardier lay flat in the nose of the plane, looking down through a small window at the ground below. He looked through Norden's eyepiece, which showed him a magnified view of the target. The Norden was connected to the plane's controls. Once the bombardier locked onto the target, the machine actually flew the plane for the last few minutes of the bombing run. It kept the plane level and straight even when the pilot's hands shook or when explosions nearby tried to push the plane off course. The bombardier fed information into the Norden by turning small knobs. He told it the plane's altitude, the wind speed, the type of bomb being carried. The machine's gears spun and clicked. Inside, a small gyroscope stayed perfectly level no matter how much the plane bounced. Mirrors reflected the view of the ground under crosshairs that moved automatically to track the target. When everything lined up just right, the Norden released the bombs at the exact perfect moment. The moment when the laws of physics would carry those bombs in a graceful arc down to Earth and place them exactly where they needed to go. Strategic effect was devastating in ways that went beyond just destroyed buildings. When the Germans knew bombs would miss by half a mile, they built their factories in clusters. If one got hit, the others would keep running. Now that strategy failed. The Americans could hit all the factories in order, one by one, each raid placed with surgical care. German war production began to collapse. They could not make enough ball bearings, so tanks sat unfinished. They could not refine enough oil, so planes stayed on the ground. They could not repair the railroad bridges fast enough, so supplies never reached the front lines. The German people looked up at American bombers flying in formation at heights where they looked like tiny silver crosses in the sky. And they knew those bombers could reach down with impossible accuracy and touch any part of their country. The fear was not just about the bombs that fell. It was about knowing the bombs would fall exactly where the Americans wanted them to fall. There was no hiding from that kind of power. No amount of camouflage or deception would matter if the enemy could see through clouds and calculate the future path of falling metal with machine precision. Something else was happening that the Germans did not know about yet. The Norden was not working as well as the publicity claimed. Yes, it could achieve 75-foot accuracy in perfect conditions. But perfect conditions were rare. Most missions still faced clouds, smoke, fighter attacks, and terrified young men trying to work complicated equipment while people shot at them. The real accuracy was closer to 300 feet under good conditions, and much worse under bad ones. Many bombs are still missing. Many missions had to turn back because clouds covered the targets, and the Norden needed to see the ground to work. The machine was amazing, but it was not magic. The gap between what the Norden could do in theory and what it did in practice was wide. Yet the Germans saw only the results. They saw the missions that worked and not the ones that failed. They saw the photographs of direct hits and not the reports of bombs wasted on empty fields. The myth of the Norden grew larger than the reality, and that myth changed how Germany fought the war. The winter of 1944 brought weather that made the Norden bombsight almost useless. Thick clouds covered Germany for weeks at a time. The clouds sat at 15,000 feet, gray and heavy like wet wool, and the bombers flew above them at 20,000 feet or higher. The bombardiers lay in the nose of their planes and looked down through Norden's eyepiece and saw nothing but white mist. The machine needed to see the target to work. It needed the bombardier to line up the crosshairs on a building or a bridge or a factory chimney. When clouds hid everything, the Norden was just an expensive piece of metal that could not help anyone. The mission still flew because the orders came from commanders far away who looked at maps and made plans. But the bombs fell blind, released based on guesses about where the target might be under all that white nothing. They scattered across the German countryside and hit forests and farms and small towns that had no military value at all. On clear days, the results were different, but still far from perfect. Even when the bombardier could see the target, other problems crowded in. German anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with exploding shells. Each explosion was a black cloud of smoke and hot metal fragments. When a shell burst near a bomber, the whole plane jumped sideways like a horse scared by a snake. The Norden needed the plane to fly straight and steady for at least 3 minutes while it calculated and controlled the bombing run. 3 minutes of level flight over Germany with guns shooting at you felt like 3 hours. Pilots gripped their controls and tried to hold course while their instincts screamed at them to dive and turn and get away from the exploding sky. The human factor was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. The bombardiers were young men, most of them barely 20 years old. They had trained for months on the Norden, learning its 2,000 parts and how to adjust each tiny knob and dial. But training happened over safe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. American deserts where no one shot at you. Over Germany, the bombardiers worked while German fighters attacked from every angle. Machine gun bullets punched through the thin aluminum skin of the bombers. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of engines mixed with the crack of anti-aircraft shells and the rattle of gunfire. The temperature in the nose of the plane was 40 degrees below zero. The bombardiers wore heavy gloves that made it hard to turn the small knobs on the Norden. Their oxygen masks fogged up. Their hands shook from cold and fear. Some of them got so scared they released the bombs early, just to finish the mission and let the pilot turn for home. Others froze up completely and could not make their fingers work the controls. The best bombardiers, the ones who stayed calm and did everything right, still had to deal with equipment that broke down. The Norden was an incredibly complicated machine. Its gears were tiny and precise. Dirt or ice could jam them. The electrical connections could shake loose when the plane bounced through rough air. The gyroscope could tumble and lose its reference point. Every mission, some percentage of the Norden simply stopped working. And the bombardiers had to guess where to drop their bombs using their eyes and their training and their hope that they were doing something useful. The Germans adapted quickly once they understood what they faced. They could not build their own precision bombsight, but they could make the American bombsight harder to use. They started creating smoke screens around their most important targets. Special units would light fires that created thick black smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. The smoke covered factories and oil refineries and made them invisible from above. The Norden could not hit what the bombardier could not see. German engineers also built fake factories in empty fields away from the real ones. They made them look perfect from the air, with fake buildings and fake smokestacks and fake railroad tracks leading to them. Some American bombers wasted their entire bomb loads on targets made of wood and canvas. The Germans moved their real production underground when they could, building factories inside mountains and tunnels where bombs could not reach. They spread out the parts of their production system so that hitting one target would not stop everything. Most importantly, they increased their fighter attacks during the critical 3 minutes when American bombers had to fly straight and level for the Norden to work. German pilots learned to watch for the moment when a bomber formation stopped weaving and turning. That was when the Nordens were active, when the bombardiers were locked onto their targets. The German fighters attacked hardest during those 3 minutes, trying to break up the formation and ruin the bombing run. It worked more often than the Americans wanted to admit. The truth about the Norden emerged slowly as the war went on. After each mission, intelligence officers analyzed the results and wrote reports. The reports showed that under ideal conditions, with clear weather and light defenses and experienced crews, the Norden could achieve accuracy within 100 feet about half the time. That was still remarkable, still better than any other bombing system in the world. But it was not the 75 feet from 20,000 feet that the publicity claimed. It was not bombs landing in pickle barrels. Under normal combat conditions, with clouds and smoke and flak and fighters and scared young men, the average accuracy dropped to 300 feet or more. About 30% of bombs dropped using the Norden landed more than 1,000 feet away from their targets. Some missions had accuracy so poor that it would have been better to not fly at all and save the bombs and planes and lives for another day. The military kept these numbers secret. They kept promoting the myth of Norden's perfect accuracy because the myth had power. It scared the Germans. It made American workers and citizens believe their technology was unstoppable. It justified the massive cost of the bombing campaign. The reality was more complicated and less heroic. But the myth served a purpose that reality could not match. When the war ended in May 1945, American soldiers found something interesting in the wreckage of shot-down bombers across Germany. The Germans had recovered pieces of Norden bombsights from crashed planes. They had tried desperately to understand how the device worked. In laboratories hidden in basements and caves, German engineers had spread the parts across tables and studied each gear and mirror. They had taken photographs and made drawings. They had tried to rebuild the Norden from the broken pieces they found. Some of the parts were melted from fire. Others were smashed from impact. A few were damaged by the bombardiers themselves, men who had followed their orders to destroy the Norden before abandoning their plane. The German engineers did their best with what they had. They were smart men, some of the best scientists in Europe. But the Norden was complicated in ways that made it nearly impossible to understand from fragments. It was like trying to learn how to build a watch by looking at pieces of 10 different broken watches all mixed together. The Germans never figured out how to make one that worked. They never even fully understood the mathematics that made the American version function. This failure haunted them. They knew Norden was important. They knew it was changing the war. But they could not copy it, or stop it, or even completely explain it. The American military kept the Norden secret even after Germany surrendered. They thought they might need it against Japan, and they did not want the Soviets to learn how it worked. The soldiers who had used the Norden were told to keep quiet about it. The device stayed classified, locked away in storage facilities and military museums where the public could not see it. This secrecy lasted for years after the war ended. Meanwhile, historians and military analysts started going through the records of the bombing campaign. They looked at thousands of photographs taken before and after raids. They read mission reports and damage assessments. They interviewed the men who had flown the missions and the people on the ground who had survived the bombs. Slowly, carefully, they began to build a true picture of what the Norden had actually accomplished. The picture was different from what people believed during the war. The numbers told a story that was more complicated than the legend. Out of all the bombs dropped by American bombers in Europe, only about 20% landed within 1,000 feet of their targets. 1 out of 5. The other 80% fell somewhere else, scattered across the landscape by wind and clouds and human error and equipment failure and enemy action. Within that 20%, only a fraction achieved the kind of precision that the Norden was famous for. The missions where bombs landed within 100 feet of the target were real, but they were not common. They happened under special circumstances when everything went right. Clear weather, experienced crews, weak defenses, and a bit of luck all had to come together at the same moment. The analysts discovered something else that changed how they understood the bombing campaign. The Norden's real value was not its perfect accuracy, but its consistent accuracy. Other bombing methods of the time, like dropping bombs by eye or by dead reckoning, had average errors of half a mile or more. The Norden brought that average error down to around 300 feet under good conditions. 300 feet was not 75 feet, but it was still revolutionary. It meant that if you sent enough bombers to hit a target, some of them would get close enough to cause real damage. Before the Norden, you might need 100 planes to have a chance of destroying a factory. With the Norden, you might only need 20 planes. That difference mattered enormously when you were trying to build enough bombers and train enough crews to fight a war across an entire continent. The Norden did not make precision bombing easy, but it made precision bombing possible in a way it had never been before. That was its true achievement. Less dramatic than the myth, but more important to how the war was actually won. The German perspective on the Norden became clear when Allied intelligence officers interviewed captured German commanders after the war. The interviews happened in prison camps and temporary offices, translated through interpreters, recorded in careful notes. The German officers spoke with a mixture of respect and frustration. They admitted that the Norden had forced them to change their entire defensive strategy. They had moved factories underground and spread out production and built smokescreens and increased fighter defenses. All because they believed the Americans could hit any target they chose with devastating accuracy. One German general said the fear of precision bombing had been worse than the reality. His forces had wasted resources protecting targets that were never in real danger, while other targets that seemed safe got hit anyway. The uncertainty had paralyzed decision-making. Should they concentrate their defenses around the most important targets, or spread them thin to protect everything? The Norden made both choices seem wrong. Another officer explained how the psychological impact affected German workers and civilians. When bombs fell randomly, people could tell themselves it was just bad luck, like being struck by lightning. When bombs fell with apparent precision, it felt personal, like the enemy was choosing specifically to destroy your factory or your neighborhood. That feeling of being targeted drained morale faster than the actual physical damage did. The most revealing interviews came from German scientists who had studied the Norden fragments. They described their frustration at not being able to understand how the device calculated its solutions so quickly. German bombsights used different methods and could not match the Norden's performance. The scientists had assumed the Americans must have discovered some new principle of physics or mathematics that Germany did not know. After the war, when they finally got to examine an intact Norden, they were almost disappointed. There was no magic inside it. No secret science. Just incredibly precise engineering and clever design. The Americans had not invented new mathematics. They had just built a machine that could do old mathematics very fast and very accurately under terrible conditions. The German scientists admitted they probably could have built something similar if they had started earlier and invested the same resources. But they had not believed it was possible, so they had never really tried. That failure of imagination had cost them dearly. The story of the Norden's impact on German strategy came into sharper focus as historians studied captured German documents. The Germans had made critical decisions based on their belief in the Norden's capabilities. They had pulled fighter squadrons away from the Eastern Front to defend against American bombers in the West. Those fighters might have changed the outcome of battles against the Soviet Union, had diverted workers and materials to building underground factories instead of building more tanks and planes. The underground factories took longer to construct and produced less equipment than surface factories would have. They had spent enormous effort on camouflage and deception that often did not work because the Norden was less affected by visual tricks than they thought. All of these choices made sense if the Norden really could drop bombs into pickle barrels from 4 miles up. They made less sense given what the Norden actually did. The myth of Norden's perfect accuracy had shaped German planning in ways that helped the Allies win. Even though the myth was not entirely true, Japan's experience with the Norden was different and in some ways more tragic. American bombers in the Pacific theater used the Norden less often because so many targets were hit at night or through clouds using radar guidance instead. But Japanese military planners heard about the Norden from their German allies. They heard the stories of incredible precision and unstoppable accuracy. When American B-29 bombers began attacking Japanese cities in 1944, the Japanese expected precision strikes on military and industrial targets. What they got instead was something worse. The Americans discovered that precision bombing did not work well against Japanese cities because the cities were built differently than European cities. Japanese buildings were made mostly of wood and paper, not stone and concrete. Hitting a specific factory did not matter as much because the buildings around it would burn anyway once fires started. So the Americans switched tactics. They stopped using the Norden for precision bombing and started using it to help with area bombing, dropping incendiary bombs that would create massive firestorms. The same device that was supposed to enable surgical strikes on military targets became a tool for burning entire cities. The irony was bitter. Japan had feared precision bombing and prepared for it, and then faced something even more devastating. After Japan surrendered, American investigators found Japanese attempts to build their own precision bombsight. The attempts had failed for the same reasons the German attempts failed. The engineering was too difficult. The resources were not available. The mathematics were understood but could not be implemented in a working machine under combat conditions. Japanese engineers told their American interrogators that they had believed precision bombing was the future of warfare. They had been right about that. They just had not been able to build the tools to do it themselves. This pattern repeated across both defeated nations. Everyone recognized that the Norden represented something new and important. No one except the Americans had been able to actually make it work. The declassification of the Norden secrets came gradually over the decades after the war. By the 1970s, most of the technical details were public knowledge. The device was obsolete by then, replaced by radar bombing and eventually by guided missiles that could adjust their path after being released. Modern weapons could hit targets with accuracy measured in feet, not tens of feet, and they could do it through any weather, day or night, without requiring a human to look through an eyepiece and turn tiny knobs. The Norden belonged to history. Museums displayed them with little plaques explaining their role in World War II. Documentaries filmed them sitting in glass cases, their gears frozen, their mirrors dusty. The veterans who had used them were old men by then, and they told their stories with the complicated feelings that come from surviving a war. Some remembered the Norden fondly as a tool that helped them survive, a machine that gave them a chance to hit their targets and go home. Others remembered it with frustration, thinking of all the times it failed to work, all the missions that went wrong despite the fancy equipment. A few remembered it with guilt, wondering about the bombs that missed and fell on people who had no connection to the war. The real lesson of the Norden bombsight emerged slowly as historians and military thinkers reflected on its legacy. The lesson was not about technology itself, but about the power of belief in technology. The Norden worked well enough to be useful, but not as well as people thought. That gap between perception and reality had strategic consequences that shaped the entire war. The Germans believed the Norden was nearly perfect, so they made defensive choices based on that belief. Those choices helped the Allies even when the Norden failed to perform as advertised. The myth had power that the reality alone could not match. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Nations invest in weapons that seem unstoppable, and their enemies react with fear and defensive measures that may be unnecessary. Sometimes the fear of a weapon changes behavior more than the weapon itself. The Norden showed this dynamic clearly. It was a good bombsight, perhaps the best of its time. But its reputation as a perfect bombsight affected the war more than its actual performance did. Modern military planners study the Norden as an example of how technology intersects with strategy and psychology. They learn that accuracy in testing does not always translate to accuracy in combat. They learn that the most important features of a weapon might not be its technical specifications, but how the enemy perceives and reacts to it. They learn that secrecy can create mystique that magnifies a weapon's impact. The Norden was kept so secret that the Germans never fully understood its limitations. If they had known the truth, they might have made different choices and fought differently. But they did not know, so they fought against their fear of what the Norden might be able to do, rather than against what it actually could do. That fear was a weapon in itself, invisible but powerful. The men who built the Norden never intended to create a psychological weapon. They were engineers trying to solve a technical problem. They wanted to make a device that could guide bombs accurately under combat conditions. They succeeded at creating something that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. But history remembers the Norden less for what it did and more for what people believed it could do. That belief changed how a war was fought. It pushed the Germans into defensive strategies that weakened them. It gave American bomber crews confidence, even when conditions made accuracy impossible. It represented the promise of technology to make war more precise and controllable, even though war remained chaotic and messy. In the end, the Norden bombsight teaches us that in war, and perhaps in all human endeavors, what people believe about your capabilities can matter as much as your actual capabilities. The gap between myth and reality is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is a tool to be used. The Americans used it well, whether they meant to or not. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.